Welcome. Welcome to the online class of Professor S.K. Paul, HOD, University Department of English, BRABU University, Muzaffarpur. Good afternoon, dear students of PhD coursework. Today I am going to deliver my lecture on English novels and theatre. So this essay is more on English novels and less about theatre. Let us begin. The English novel is an important part of English literature. This article mainly concerns novels written in English by novelists who were born or have spent a significant part of their lives in England or Scotland or Wales or Northern Ireland or Ireland before 1922. However, given the nature of the subject, this guideline has been applied with common sense, and reference is made to novels in other languages or novelists who are not primarily British where appropriate. The English novel has generally been seen as beginning with Daniel Defoe's Robinson Crusoe, published in 1719, and Moll Flanders, 1722, though John Bunyan's The Pilgrim's Progress, published in 1678, and Aphra Bane's Oroonoco, published in 1688, are also contenders, while earlier works such as Sir Thomas Malory's Morte d'Arthur and even the prologue to Geoffrey Chaucer's Canterbury Tales have been suggested. Another important early novel is Gulliver's Travels, written by Jonathan Swift in 1726. Jonathan Swift was an Irish writer and clergyman, which is both and this novel is both a satire of human nature as well as a parody of travelers' tales like Robinson Crusoe. The rise of the novel as an important literary genre is generally associated with the growth of the middle class in England. Other major 18th century English novelists are Samuel Richardson, 1689 to 1761, author of the epistolary novels Pamela or Virtue Rewarded, published in 1740, and Clarissa, published in 1747 to 48. Henry Fielding, 1707 to 1754. Henry Fielding, who wrote Joseph Andrews in 1742 and the History of Tom Jones, a Foundling, 1749, Lawrence Sterne, 1713 to 1768, who published Tristram Shandy in parts between 1759 and 1767, Oliver Goldsmith, 1728, 1774, author of The Vicar of Wakefield, 1766, Tobias Smollett, 1721 to 1771. A Scottish novelist best known for his comic picaresque novels such as The Adventures of Peregrine Pickle, 1751. And The Expedition of Humphrey Clinker, published in 1771, who influenced Charles Dickens and Fanny Burney, 1752 to 1840, whose novels were enjoyed and admired by Jane Austen, wrote Evelina, 1778, Cecilia, 1782, and Camellia, 1796. A noteworthy aspect of both the 18th and 19th century novel is the way the novelist directly addressed the reader. For example, the author might interrupt his or her narrative to pass judgment on a character or pity or praise another and inform or remind the reader of some other relevant issue. The phrase romantic novel has several possible meanings. Here it refers to novels written during the Romantic era in literary history, which runs from the 18th century until the beginning of the Victorian era in 1837. But to complicate matters, there are novels written in the romance, a tradition by novelists like Walter Scott, Nathaniel Hawthorne, George Meredith. In addition, the phrase today is mostly used to refer to the popular pulp fiction genre that focuses on romantic love. The Romantic period is especially associated with the poets William Blake, William Wordsworth, Samuel Taylor Coleridge, George Byron, Percy Shelley, and John Keats. The two major novelists, Jane Austen and Walter Scott, also published in the early 19th century. Horace Walpole's 1764 novel, The Castle of Otranto, invented the Gothic fiction genre. The word Gothic was originally used in the sense of medieval. This genre combines the macabre, fantastic, and supernatural, and usually involves haunted castles, graveyards, and various picturesque elements. Later, novelist Anne Radcliffe introduced the brooding figure of the Gothic villain, which developed into the Byronic hero. Her most popular and influential work, The Mysteries of Udolpho, published in 1794, is frequently described as the archetypal Gothic novel. Vathek, 1786, by William Beckford, and The Monk, published in 1796 by Matthew Lewis, were further notable early works in both the Gothic and horror genres. Mary Shelley's novel Frankenstein, published in 1818, is another important Gothic novel, as well as being an early example of science fiction. The vampire genre fiction began with John William Polidori's The Vampire, published in 1819. This short story was inspired by the life of Lord Byron and his poem The Guelph. An important later work is Varney the Vampire, 1845, where many standard vampire conventions originated. Varney has fangs, leaves two puncture wounds on the neck of his victims, and has hypnotic powers of superhuman strength. Varney has also the first example of the sympathetic vampire who loathes his condition but is a slave to it. Among more minor novelists in this period, Maria Edgeworth, 1768 to 1849, and Thomas Love Peacock, 1785 to 1866, are worthy of comment. Edgeworth's novel Castle Recreant, published in 1800, is the first fully developed regional novel in English, as well as the first true historical novel in English, and an important influence on Walter Scott. Peacock was primarily a satirist in novels such as Nightmare Abbey, published in 1888, and the Misfortunes of Elphin, published in 1829. Jane Austen was born in 1775 and died in 1817. So Jane Austen's works critique the novels of sensibility of the second half of the 18th century and are part of the transition to the 19th century realism. Her plots, though fundamentally comic, highlight the dependence of women on marriage to secure social standing and economic security. Austen brings to light the hardships women faced, who usually did not inherit money, could not work, and where their only chance in life depended on the man they married. She reveals not only the difficulties women faced in her day, but also what was expected of men and of the careers they had to follow. This she does with wit and humor, and with endings where all characters, good or bad, receive exactly what they deserve. Her work brought her little personal fame and only a few positive reviews during her lifetime, but the publication of 1869 of her nephew's A Memoir of Jane Austen introduced her to a wider public, and by the 1940s she had become accepted as a major writer. The second half of the 20th century saw a proliferation of Austen scholarship and the emergence of a genitive fan culture. Austen's works include Pride and Prejudice, 1813, Sense and Sensibility, 1811, Mansfield Park, Persuasion, and Emma. The other major novelist at the beginning of the early 19th century was Sir Walter Scott, published in Walter Scott. His timeline is 1771 to 1832. So Scott was not only a highly successful British novelist, but the greatest single influence on fiction in the 19th century, and a European figure. Scott established the genre of the historical novel with a series of Waverley novels, including Waverley, published in 1814, The Antiquary, 1816, and The Heart of Midlothian, published in 1818. However, Austen is today widely read and the source for films and television series, while Scott is less often read. It was in the Victorian era, 1837 to 1901, that the novel became the leading literary genre in English. A number of women novelists were successful in the 19th century, although they often had to use a masculine pseudonym. At the beginning of the 19th century, most novels were published in 3 volumes. However, monthly serialization was revived with the publication of Charles Dickens's Pickwick Papers in 20 parts between April 1836 and November 1837. Demand was high for each episode to introduce some new element, whether it was a plot twist or a new character, or so as to maintain the reader's interest. Both Dickens and Thackeray frequently published this way. The 1830s and 1840s saw the rise of social novel, also known as social problem novel, that arose out of the social and political upheavals which followed the Reform Act of 1832. This was in many ways a reaction to rapid industrialization and the social, political, and economic issues associated with it, and was a means of commenting on abuses of government and industry and the suffering of the poor, who were not profiting from England's economic prosperity. Stories of the working class poor were directed toward middle class to help create sympathy and promote change. An early example is Charles Dickens's Oliver Twist. Charles Dickens emerged on the literary scene in the 1830s with the two novels already mentioned. Dickens wrote vividly about London life and the struggles of the poor, but in good-humored fashion, accessible to readers of all classes. One of his most popular works to this day is A Christmas Carol, published in 1843. In more recent years, Dickens has been most admired for his later novels such as Dombey and the Son, published between 1846 and 48. Great Expectations, published between 1860 and 61, Bleak House 1852 and 53, and Little Dorrit 1855-57, and Our Mutual Friend 1864-65. An early rival to Dickens was William Makepeace Thackeray, who during the Victorian period ranked secondly only to him, but he is now much less read and is known almost exclusively for Vanity Fair, published in 1847. In that novel, he satirizes whole swaths of humanity while retaining a light touch. It features his most memorable character, the engagingly roguish Becky Sharp. The Bronte sisters were other significant novelists in the 1840s and 1850s. Their novels caused a sensation when they were first published, but were subsequently accepted as classics. They had written compulsively from early childhood and were first published at their own expense in 1846 as poets under the pseudonyms Currer, Ellis, and Acton Bell. The sisters returned to prose, producing a novel each the following year: Shalt's Jane Eyre, Emily's Wuthering Heights, and Annie's Agnes Grey, later Annie's The Tenant of Wildfell Hall, published in 1848, and Shalt's Villety, 1853, were published. Elizabeth Gaskell was also a successful writer, and first novel, Mary Barton, was published anonymously in 1848. Gaskell's North and South contrasts the lifestyle in the industrial north of England with the wealthier south. Even though her writing conforms to Victorian conventions, Gaskell usually frames her stories as critics of contemporary attitudes. Her only works focused on factory work in the Midlands. She always emphasized the role of women with complex narratives and dynamic female characters. Anthony Trollope, 1815 to 1882, was one of the most successful, prolific, and respected English novelists of the Victorian era. Some of his best loved works are set in the imaginary country of Barsetshire, including The Warden, 1855, and the Barchester Towers, 1857. He also wrote perceptive novels on political, social, and gender issues, and on other topical matters, including The Way with Life Now, published in 1875. Trollope's novels portrayed the lives of the land-owning and professional classes of early Victorian England. George Eliot's Mary Ann Evans. It is pseudonym. George Eliot is a pseudonym. Her real name was Mary Ann Evans, 1818 to 1880. First novel, Adam Bede, was published in 1859. Her works, especially Middlemarch, 1871 to 72, are important examples of literary realism and are admired for their combination of high Victorian literary detail combined with an intellectual breadth of breadth that removes them from the narrow geographic confines they often depict. An interest in rural matters and changing social and economic situation of the countryside is seen in the novels of Thomas Hardy, born in 1840 and died in 1928, a Victorian realist in the tradition of George Eliot. He was also influenced both in the novels and poetry by Romanticism, especially by William Wordsworth. Charles Darwin is another important influence on Thomas Hardy. Like Charles Dickens, he was also highly critical of much in Victorian society. Though Hardy focused more on a declining rural society, while Hardy wrote poetry throughout his life and regarded himself primarily as a poet. His first collection was not published until 1898, so that initially he gained fame as the author of such novels as Far from the Madding Crowd, published in 1874, The Mayor of Casterbridge, published in 1886, Taste of the Urban Village, 1891, and Jude the Obscure, 1895. He ceased writing novels following adverse criticism of this last novel. In novels such as The Mayor of Casterbridge and Taste of the Urban Village, Hardy attempts to create modern works in the genre of tragedy that are modeled on the Greek drama, especially Aeschylus and Sophocles, though in prose, not poetry, a novel, not drama, and with characters of a low social standing, not nobility. Another significant the 19th century novelist is George Gissing, 1857 to 1903, who published 23 novels between 1880 and 1903. His best novel is New Grub Street, published in 1891. Important developments occurred in genre fiction in this era. Although predated by John Ruskin's The King of the Golden River in 1841, the history of the modern fantasy genre is generally said to begin with George MacDonald, the influential author of The Princess and the Goblin of Fantasties, 1858. William Morris was a popular English poet who also wrote several fantasy novels during the latter part of the 20th century. Wilkie Collins's epistolary novel, The Moonstone, published in 1868, is generally considered the first detective novel in the English language. While The Woman in White is regarded as one of the finest sensation novels. H.G. Wells's 1866 to 1946 writing career began in the 1890s with science fiction like The Time Machine 1895 and The War of the Worlds 1898, which describes an invasion of late Victorian England by Martians, and Wells is seen along with a Frenchman, Jules Verne, 1828 to 1905, as a major figure in the development of the science fiction genre. He also wrote realistic fiction about the lower middle class in novels like Kipps 1905 and The History of Mr. Polly 1910. The major novelists writing in Britain at the start of the 20th century were an Irishman, James Joyce, 1882 to 1941, and two immigrants, American Henry James, 1843 to 1916, and Paul Joseph Conrad, 1857 to 1924. The modernist tradition in the novel, with its emphasis towards the ever more minute and analytic exposition of mental life, begins with James and Conrad in novels such as The Ambassadors, published in 1903, The Golden Bough, 1907, and Lord Jim, 1900. Other important early modernists were Dorothy Richardson, 1873 to 1957, whose novel Pointed Roof, published in 1915, is one of the earliest examples of the stream of consciousness technique, and D.H. Lawrence, 1885 to 1930, who wrote with understanding about the social life of the lower and middle classes and the personal life of those who could not adapt to the social norms of his time. Sons and Lovers, published in 1913, is widely regarded as his earliest masterpiece. There followed The Rainbow in 1915, though it was immediately seized by the police, and its sequel, Women in Love, published in 1920. Lawrence attempted to explore human emotions more deeply than his contemporaries and challenged the boundaries of the acceptable treatment of sexual issues, most notably in Lady Chatterley's Lover, which was privately published in Florence in 1928. However, the unexpurgated version of this novel was not published until 1959. Then in 1920, Irishman James Joyce's important modernist novel Ulysses appeared. Ulysses has been called a demonstration and summation of the entire movement, set during one day in Dublin in June 1904. In its choice creates parallels with Homer's epic poem, The Odyssey. Another significant modernist in 1920 was Virginia Woolf, 1882 to 1941, who was an influential feminist and a major stylistic innovator associated with the stream of consciousness technique. Her novels include Mrs. Dalloway, published in 1925, To the Lighthouse, 1927, and The Waves, published in 1931. Her essay collection, A Room of One's Own, published in 1929, contains her famous dictum, "A woman must have money and a room of her own if she is to write fiction." Virginia Woolf. But while modernism was to become an important literary movement in the early decades of the new century, there were also many fine novelists who were not modernists. This include E.M. Forster, 1879 to 1970, John Galsworthy, 1867 to 1933, Nobel Prize in Literature, 1932, whose novels include the Forsyte Saga, Arnold Bennett, 1867 to 1931, author of The Old Wives' Tale, and H.G. Wells, 1866 to 1946. Though Forster's work is frequently regarded as containing both the modernist and Victorian elements. E.M. Forster's A Passage to India, published in 1924, reflected challenges to imperialism, while his earlier works, such as A Room with a View, published in 1908, and Howard's End, published in 1910, examined the restrictions and hypocrisy of Edwardian society in England. The most popular British writer of the early years of 20th century was arguably Rudyard Kipling, 1865 to 1936, a highly versatile writer of novels, short stories, and poems, and to date the youngest ever recipient of the Nobel Prize for Literature in 1907. A significant English writer in the 1930s and 1940s was George Orwell, 1903 to 1950, who is especially remembered for his satires of totalitarianism, 1984, published in 1949, and Animal Farm, published in 1945. Evelyn Waugh, 1903 to 66, satirized the bright young things of the 1920s and 1930s, notably in A Handful of Dust in 1934 and Decline and Fall, 1928, while Brideshead Revisited, 1945, has a theological basis, setting out to examine the effect of divine grace on its main characters. Aldous Huxley, 1894 to 1963, published his famous dystopia Brave New World in 1932, the same year as John Cooper Powys, 1872 to 1963. A Glastonbury romance. Samuel Beckett, 1906 to 89, published his first major work, the novel Murphy, in 1938. This same year, Graham Greene's 1904 to 1991 first major novel, Brighton Rock, was published. Then, in 1939, James Joyce published Finnegan's Wake. In his work, Joyce creates a special language to express the consciousness of a character who is dreaming. Graham Greene was an important novelist whose works spanned the 1930s to the 1980s. Greene was a convert to Catholicism, and his novels explored the ambivalent moral and political issues of the modern world. Notable for an ability to combine serious literary acclaim with a broad popularity, his novels include The Heart of the Matter, 1948, A Burnt Out Case, 1961, and The Human Factor, 1978. Evelyn Waugh's 1903 to 1966 career also continued after World War II, and in 1961 he completed his most considerable work, a trilogy about the war entitled A Sword of Honor. In 1947, Malcolm Lowry published Under the Volcano. While George Orwell's satire of totalitarianism, 1984, was published in 1949, one of the most influential novels of the immediate post-war period was William Cooper's 1910 to 2002, naturalistic scenes from provincial life, published in 1950, which was a conscious rejection of the modernist tradition. Other novelists writing in the 1950s and later were Anthony Powell, 1905 to 2000, whose 12-volume cycle of novels, A Dance to the Music of Time, and A Dance to the Music of the Time, is a comic examination of movements and manners, power and passivity in English political cultural, and military life in the mid-20th century. Comic novelist Kingsley Amis is best known for his academic satire Lucky Jim, published in 1954. Nobel Prize laureate William Golding's allegorical novel Lord of the Flies, published in 1954, explores how culture created by man fails, using as an example a group of British schoolboys marooned on a deserted island. Philosopher Irish Murdoch was a prolific writer of novels that deal with such things as sexual relationships, morality, and the power of the unconscious. Her works, including Under the Net, 1954, The Black Prince, 1973, and The Green Knight, 1993. A Scottish writer, Muriel Sparks, also began publishing in the 1950s. She pushed the boundaries of realism in her novels. Her first, The Comforters, published in 1957, concerns a woman who becomes aware that she is a character in a novel. The Prime of Miss Jean Brodie, 1961, at times takes the reader briefly into the distant future to see the various fates that befall its characters. Anthony Burgess is especially remembered for his dystopian novel, A Clockwork Orange, 1962, set in the not too distant future, which was made into a film by Stanley Kubrick in 1971. In the entirely different genre of Gothic fantasy, Madeline Pick, 1911 to 68, published his highly successful Gormenghast trilogy between 1946 and 1959. Immigrant authors played a major role in post-war literature. Doris Lessing, 1919, from southern Rhodesia, now Zimbabwe, published her first novel, The Grass is Singing, in 1950. After immigrating to England, she initially wrote about the African experiences. Lessing soon became a dominant presence in the English literary scene, frequently publishing right through the century, and won the Nobel Prize for Literature in 2007. Salman Rushdie, born in 1947, is another among a number of post-Second World War writers from the former British colonies who permanently settled in Britain. Rushdie achieved fame with Midnight Children in 1981, which was awarded both the James Tate Black Memorial Prize and Booker Prize, and named Booker of Bookers in 1993. His most controversial novel, The Satanic Verses, published in 1989, was inspired in part by the life of Muhammad. B.S. Naipaul, 1932 to 2018, born in Trinidad, was another immigrant who wrote, among other things, A House of Mr. Biswas, 1961, and A Bend in the River, 1979. Naipaul won the Nobel Prize in Literature. Also from the West Indies, George Lamming, born in 1927, is best remembered for In the Castle of the Skin, 1953. Another important immigrant writer, Kazuo Ishiguro, born 1954, was born in Japan, but his parents immigrated to Britain when he was 6. His works include The Remains of the Day, 1989, Never Let Me Go, 2005. Scotland has, in the late 20th century, produced several important novelists, including James Kelman, born in 1946, who, like Samuel Beckett, can create humor out of the most grim situations. How Late It Was, How Late, won the Booker Prize that year. A.L. Kennedy, born 1965, whose 2007 novel Day was named Book of the Year in the Costa Book Awards. In 2007, she won the Austrian State Prize for European Literature. Alasdair Gray, 1934 to 2019, whose Lanark, A Life in 4 Books, 1981, is a dystopian fantasy set in his hometown Glasgow. Another contemporary Scot is Irvine Welsh, whose novel Trainspotting, 1993, gives a brutal depiction of the lives of the working class Edinburgh drug users. Angela Carter, 1940 to 1992. Angela Carter was a novelist and journalist known for her feminist magical realism and picaresque works, writing from the 1960s until the 1980s. Her novels include The Infernal Desire Machines of Dr. Hoffman, published in 1972, and Nights at the Circus, 1984. Margaret Drabble, born 1939, is a novelist, biographer, and critic who has published from the 1960s until this century. Her older sister, A.S. Batt, born in 1936, is best known for his possession published in 1990. Martin Amis, born 1949, is one of the most prominent of contemporary British novelists. His best known novels are Money and London Fields. Pat Barker, born 1943, has won many awards for her fiction. Novelist and screenwriter Ian McEwan, born 1948, is another of contemporary Britain's most highly regarded writers. His works include The Cement Garden, published in 1978, and Enduring Love, 1997, which was made into a film. In 1998, McEwan won the Man Booker Prize with Amsterdam, while Atonement in 2001 was made into an Oscar-winning film. McEwan was awarded the Jerusalem Prize in 2011. Zadie Smith's, born 1975, a Whitbread Book Award-winning novel, White Teeth, 2000, mixes pathos. Among popular novelists, Daphne du Maurier wrote Rebecca, a mystery novel in 1938, and W. Somerset Maugham, 1874 to 1965, of Human Bondage, published in 1915, a strongly autobiographical novel, is generally agreed to be his masterpiece. In genre fiction, Agatha Christie was an important writer of crime novels, short stories, and plays, best remembered for her 18 detective novels and her successful West End theatre plays. Christie's novels include Murder on the Orient Express, Death on the Nile, and Then There Were None. Another popular writer during the golden age of detective fiction was Dorothy L. Sayers, while Georgette Hare created the historical romance genre. Theatre academic and cultural commentator Christopher Bixby makes the point that theatre, as opposed to, say, the novel, is essentially a public experience, where a novel may make comment on political issues. It does do in private, in a one-to-one relationship between author and reader. A play, on the other hand, is written for the public. It is experienced live and with a live audience of others who are experiencing the same production as you are in the same moment. This, for Bixby, is what makes theatre uniquely poised to draw parallels between the specifics of the drama on the stage and the generalities of the social and political contexts of the play's writing, its original and its revival productions. The Crucible was Arthur Miller's third major play, coming after 1947's All My Sons and 1952's Death of a Salesman. Miller was by then established a major playwright, having won the Pulitzer Prize for Salesman. Now, uh, some novels of the 21st century. White Teeth by Z.D. Smith. White Teeth plays out its bounding, vibrant course in a Jamaican hair salon in North London, an Indian restaurant in Leicester Square, an Irish ballroom, a turned immigrant cafe, a liberal public school, and a slick science institute, while it takes on faith, race, gender, history, and culture. Z.D. Smith's dazzling first novel is not to be missed. The Paying Guests by Sarah Waters. Sarah Waters earned a reputation as one of Britain's great writers of historical fiction, and here she delivers again a love story, a tension-filled crime story, and a beautifully atmospheric portrait of 1920s London. This is her finest achievement yet. The Ocean at the End of the Lane by Neil Gaiman. The poignant fairy tale from the modern master of wonder is a bewitching and harrowing story of mystery and a survival, memory, and magic. Cloud Atlas by David Mitchell, a visionary voice in different first century fiction. David Mitchell combines a keen eye for character and a taste for mind-bending philosophical and scientific speculation to explore fundamental questions of reality and identity. Life After Life by Kate Atkinson. If there were an infinite number of chances to live your life, would you be able to save the world from its own destiny? Wildly inventive, darkly comic, and startlingly poignant, this is Kate Atkinson at her absolute best. Wolf Hall by Hilary Mantel. One of Britain's most accomplished, acclaimed, and garlanded writers, Hilary Mantel brutally and acutely recreates Tudor England in this Man Booker Prize winning novel. She deploys her gifts for penetrating, unsparing characterization to breathe thrilling new life into the well-trodden territory of Henry VIII and his court. In a dark, dark wood by Ruth Ware. What should be a cozy and fun-filled weekend in the English countryside takes a sinister turn in this gripping, suspenseful, and darkly twisted literary debut. The Girl Next Door by Ruth Rendell. The discovery of human remains in a long forgotten tin box sends the shock waves across a group of long-time friends. In this psychologically explosive story from the late Ruth Rendell, the grand dame of British crime writing. Me Before You by Jojo Moyes. Ever since she debuted stateside, Americans have fallen in love with Jojo Moyes and her opposites attract love stories. This is the word of mouth sensation that put her on the map. You will laugh, you will weep, and when you turn the last page, you will want to start all over again. Atonement by Ian McEwan, a symphonic and heartbreaking novel of love and war, childhood and class, and guilt and forgiveness that provides all the satisfaction of a brilliant narrative and the provocation we have come to expect from the master of English prose. The Sense of an Ending. The Sense of an Ending by Julian Barnes, a novel so compelling that it begs to be read in a single sitting. This Booker Prize winning novel of stunning psychological and emotional depth and sophistication is a brilliant new chapter in Julian Barnes's Over. Little B by Chris Cliff. This novel of a young Nigerian refugee seeking asylum in Great Britain is a story of uncertainty, courage, and profound humanity rendered in brutal yet gorgeous prose. So this way, dear students, I have completed my lecture today. Thank you for your patient hearing. Thank you.